Hi y'all, it's Shay. I hope everyone is having a great summer, super productive and enjoying the weather wherever you may be. Per the title of this presentation, the method that I'll be talking about is going to be autoethnography. So we'll start with a little bit of history about autoethnography. Um, as this is a qualitative methods course, autoethnography is a type of qualitative research. Autoethnography is a product of postmodern philosophy, which I believe we touched on in a couple of our classes previously, namely Eric's org theory class and then Gloria's research perspectives class. Pardon me, last term. But just a little bit of a refresher. Postmodern philosophy um, is basically when we start to see a challenge on traditional science and research, and ultimately a challenge to how knowledge is legitimized. As far as autoethnography is concerned, there is some uncertainty around a concrete definition for the term. So what I put together here is like a timeline to kind of track the development of the term and the functions of the term as we've come to know it today. So in 1979, uh, autoethnography was also known as like insider ethnography. So like almost like a branch off ethnography. And with insider ethnography, according to Hanyano, cited in 1979. And if you want any of these sources, y'all, I'm happy to share them with you all. Um, but insider ethnography basically focused on the study of a culture or the study of the culture of a group in which the researcher was part of. So that was just the basic foundation of autoethnography. In the 1980s, we get into a period of the crisis of representation, which came about as qualitative research in and of itself began to develop more. Qualitative research went through a couple of development stages. So in the 80s, it was during the period of crisis of representation. And this is when we see autoethnography itself being a bit more developed. So it became more focused on how self perception influenced cultural beliefs, experiences, and practices. Um, and according to Mendez, cited for 2013, and also some of Holt, which is cited as 2003. Again, like I said, I'm happy to share these references with you all. Autoethnography emerged due to the calls to place a greater emphasis on the way in which the ethnographer or the researcher interacts with the culture that they are researching. So we began to see more of that in the 80s. A decade later, in the 90s, we see another shift with autoethnography that focuses more so on personal narratives. So, again, getting into how we know it today. And then, of course, in the 2000s and the 2010s and up until currently, right? Ellis, who was a leading scholar around autoethnography, and Bachner, they describe autoethnography as an autobiographical genre of writing that displays multiple layers of consciousness connecting the personal to the cultural. Right, so we get to see more concrete acceptance of what autoethnography is and how it functions as we get into the 2000s. A more recent definition, 2015, in the book Autoethnography: Understanding Qualitative Research. Um, a more recent definition says that autoethnography is a research method that uses a researcher's personal experience to describe and critique cultural beliefs, practices, and experiences. So, incorporating a lot of what we see in the 80s, but also using the researcher's lens to try to interpret and describe and critique as well those same cultural beliefs, practices, and experiences. Um, Autoethnography acknowledges and values a researcher's relationship with others in the community. Um, and autoethnography shows people in the process of figuring out what to do, how to live, and the meaning of their struggles. So it's definitely an extremely useful tool when we're talking about research, specifically qualitative research, and understanding just people and how they are in their undisturbed natural environment. Okay, so some key traits of autoethnography. Um, Again, because there's a lot of conversation around like what the key traits are. Um, a lot of criticisms on it as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment when we look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. But I've narrowed it down to three really distinct traits when looking at autoethnography. One is that the role of the autoethnographer, we should examine the role of the autoethnographer in the narrative, right? So, questions to ask, right? Is the autoethnographer an insider or an outsider of the phenomenon being described? Reed Denahe, pardon me, expands on this significantly in her book. It's absolutely amazing how definitely, if you're interested in doing an autoethnography study for your dissertation or any kind of work, the Reed Denahe piece is definitely something I recommend. It's a bit dated, 1997, but still had extremely useful information. So continuing on to the next trait, whose voice is being heard, right, throughout the narrative? Who is speaking? Is it the people under investigation or is it the researcher? It is extremely important to make that distinction, especially when we get into conversations about validity, transferability, and just the overall quality of the study. And the ethics of the study, right? It's important that that is very clear in the study. So that can also that's also something that you want to look at. And then the cultural displacement. Some realities are being described by people who have been displaced from their natural environment due to a number of issues that can be political or social. And this is definitely going to impact their perspective. And this should be considered as you go through an autoethnography. So, a little bit more information about how autoethnography looks like at play in the field. So, as you see here, we talk about how autoethnography can be a range of can take a range of forms, right? So, according to Ellis and Bachner and also Masso in the early 2000s, right? So, autoethnography can range from research about personal experiences to a research process, to parallel exploration of the researchers and the participants' experiences about the experience of the research while conducting a specific piece of research, right? So that's a mouthful, a whole lot about research. So let's unpack that a little bit. So autoethnography can, in its simplest form, just be the researcher's experience as part of that community, right? So that's in its simplest form, in its purest form, it can be that. But also, that researcher can make the process extremely complex by talking about their own experiences as a part of the community and still trying to give some understanding to the behaviors of others. So that's when it's not becoming such a personal experience, but you're pulling in others as well. Those other people obviously being the participants in some of the case, or just giving some commentary about what is happening in that community, in that culture, and getting back to how that researchers personal beliefs interact with those again their beliefs, their perspectives, how they view that culture and their norms as well. And we in 2007 we get another piece from Ellis about how autoethnography looks in the field, right? So a more developed opinion from her earlier 2000 piece. And she says that doing autoethnography, I love that she uses like autoethnography in that way. So like doing the work of autoethnography involves a back and forth movement between experiencing and examining a vulnerable self, right? So doing that self work on you as a person and observing and revealing the broader context of that experience. So how you immerse and how your experiences lead to how you evaluate your subject, which is usually like again that culture, that group, or whatever it is that you're examining. Okay, so autoethnography in the field. We'll talk about how autoethnography looks in education in just a moment, but autoethnography can be useful in many different fields. I've listed for you here a couple of fields where it's super popular. So we have communication studies. Obviously, we can see how it can be useful there. Performance studies, English literature, anthropology, social work, a wealth of other areas in which autoethnography, can be useful. But for the purposes of this presentation, we'll move it on along and focus on the how autoethnography looks in education. Okay, so popular uses in education research. So we just talked about a long list of different areas that autoethnography is useful. So now we'll turn more so to how it looks in education and research, and then we'll look at a couple of articles as well. So in education research, autoethnography can take a couple of different shapes. I've listed two that I thought of immediately here. So one being that we can explore and develop the role of, or similar roles to that of, the researcher. So if someone is telling you about their experience, that as an audience member, you can take in that feedback to make some constructive changes in the workplace, in just the space in general, to try to make those positive experiences for people who are like the person who is writing this autoethnography. So ultimately, it can be a learning experience. And I do believe that autoethnographies can lead to transformational learning, right? I saw that documented in a lot of the readings that I did in preparation for this. And it's true that autoethnography can be a very powerful tool when we're talking about transformational learning. So that's something to consider. And also, it can be used to explore relationship dynamics, right? So thinking back about transformational learning, it permits the opportunity for people to just get a better understanding, more in-depth and personal account of how people feel in relationships. And by relationships, I mean like the advisor and the advisee, the supervisor and the supervisee, maybe like a student employee with a professional staff supervisor, or student employees with student leaders who take on the responsibilities as a supervisor. So that's getting into really lush discussion about privilege and, having someone who you consider your peers having like leadership over you in an undergraduate capacity. So that's definitely an opportunity for education there. And that's how that could look and how it could be beneficial in educational research. Okay, so let's talk about the different forms of autoethnography for just a second. So there are different forms to autoethnography, and what those forms look like have been discussed widely in conversations around qualitative research and more specifically autoethnography. So different scholars and authors call it different things, but the most overwhelming reference that I saw that talks about the different forms of autoethnography refer to it as analytic and evocative. Right? So analytic and evocative research, which was made popular by a scholar who studies autoethnography called Anderson. This is in a 2015 article. Like again, I said, these references will be available to you. So analytic autoethnography has three key distinctions, right? So the researcher is a full member in the research group or setting. The researcher remains viable throughout the text, so that the researcher is fully immersed throughout the paper or throughout the document that they're producing, throughout their narrative. And the researcher is committed to developing theoretical understandings of broader social phenomena, right? So they want to provide some kind of knowledge, some kind of enlightenment, some kind of understanding as to what exactly is taking place with the phenomenon. And then, of course, you have the evocative autoethnography. And simply put, evocative autoethnography focuses on the researcher's introspection on a particular topic. And it is used as capital to allow readers to make a connection with the researcher's feelings and experiences. So analytic autoethnography seems to be focused more so just on the researcher telling about their study, right? Telling about their experiences and putting that information out there. Whereas the evocative autoethnography seems to be focused more so on actually connecting with the reader and trying to get the reader to have feelings, right? And to really connect with that experience. All right, so some of the advantages of autoethnography include really deep insight on people and groups, right? And on the phenomenon ultimately. You get private access in a way that other methods just don't allow. Ultimately, it's like an ease of access to the subject because usually the researcher themselves are a major part of the process. So you always have access to you, right? Um, Another advantage is that it encourages readers and learners to view perspectives outside of their own. Challenging one to be open-minded is always a positive as far as I'm concerned. And it allows researchers the outlet to voice their own story through research, right? So how often do we see somebody else just trying to tell somebody else's story, and who can tell you a story better than you, right? So I appreciate that it permits the researcher that opportunity to do that. And then the last point that I mentioned is that it is emancipative in nature, and that the researcher can tell their own story instead of having someone else give it, as I just mentioned. So it kind of ties in with the previous point. Um, there's always a bit of colonization over views, I'd argue, when we look at really deep personal groups and cultures, and you have somebody from the outside looking in trying to interpret and tell that story, and oftentimes it can be misconstrued. So autoethnography allows the researcher to shape that narrative, and so that's definitely a benefit to this as well. All right, now let's look at some of the limitations of autoethnography. One thing to definitely consider is that these are usually pretty heavy topics, and the researchers are usually pretty passionate about them, right? So when we're passionate about something, we have very strong feelings about them, and people may disagree, and oftentimes do disagree. So this may lead to your reader having a negative response to your research. Um, and because your research is usually, super personal, we're sensitive about our shit. So we don't want to have someone attack us or feel like we're being attacked about something that's so personal to us. But this is definitely something that could happen in academia. No matter how personal it is, we open ourselves up to be scrutinized when we put out our work. So that's definitely an option. Our reader and our audience may have a negative response. And the second limitation is that the researcher puts themselves at risk in the field. So the truth of the matter is that when you're doing autoethnography, you're dealing with something that's super personal oftentimes. You're putting your thoughts, your values, you're putting it out there for the field to see, your peers, your colleagues. And should they respond negatively to that, these are the same people who may be looking to hire you or maybe on a search committee for you. And based on what you include in that document, no matter what protections are in place by the university, human nature takes precedent oftentimes, and those things may be considered. So you'll want to consider what you're putting out there as well and how it could impact you in the long run. And then thirdly, it could lead to a number of ethical issues, which I mentioned earlier. So usually when we're telling these personal stories, there are other people who are involved. For example, if you're telling about your family, right? Your family members, especially if you're going to mention their name and you don't have consent, that's an ethical issue. So you want to make sure that you're still adhering to IRB procedures, make sure that you're still adhering to all of those the ethics checklist that we visited a couple times, that we looked at in several classes. You want to make sure that you're still adhering to that. With that ease of access, which we've already called an advantage, comes this very easy pitfall if you're not careful, which is that we can just get overwhelmed with things and not follow the proper protocol, which could have us in a big hot ass mess. And we don't want that. Okay, so a couple of a sample research question that I came up with that could lead to some autoethnography, some autoethnographical research is here. What is the Black administrator's experience in achieving promotions for leadership positions at a PWI? That would be a great learning opportunity for PWIs and administrators and decision makers at PWIs, and hopefully could influence some change based off the answer. Again, getting back to that transformational learning piece. All right. So on to the sample article. So we have two here. Let's start with navigating as an African American female scholar, catalysts and barriers in predominantly white academic spaces. Okay, so what I pulled from these articles is the research question and the purpose of the article. So the activity that I like you to do is, once we look at the research question and then the purpose, pause the video and then just jot down why is this an autoethnography? Like, what classifies it as an autoethnography based off the information that you learned in this presentation. I'm happy to discuss. If you want to just put it like in a discussion board, or if you want to just email it to me, that's cool. Whatever's clever. But I just like for you to like kind of see if you understand what makes this study an autoethnography. So again, the title of this particular article is Navigating as an African American Female Scholar, Catalysts and Barriers in Predominantly White Academia. Okay, so the research question, as articulated by the authors, is how does one manage to critique higher education systems while working in higher education systems? So while being of the system, how can you critique it when you're in it, right? So that's the research question. And the author says that the purpose of this study is to examine the manner in which borders are created, navigated, and crossed within the spaces that engage in counter hegemonic praxis at the micro levels of the institution. So those are your questions, and that's your question and your purpose. And like I said, if you need to pause or if you want to rewind or whatever you want to do, just jot down like a few sentences about what makes this an autoethnography. Okay. And then for the second article, we have You're Such a Good Friend. I love this article, by the way. It examines friendship from a qualitative lens. So, You're Such a Good Friend, a woven autoethnographic, narrative discussion on disability and friendship in higher education. So a really good article. So the question is, how can conceptualizations of friendship advance our understandings of able-bodiedness, disability, in educational realms? And the purpose of this narrative, the purpose of this article, is to examine the role of friendship in describing disabling physical and attitudinal access to barriers in the university setting. Okay, so pick either of those articles, or if you have time and you would like to do both, and just kind of jot down a few sentences about, based off what you learned, that helps you classify this as an autoethnographical study outside of it just being in the title. Like, I want to see if you all kind of understand the tools that I was giving you to kind of help you identify those things. All right, so that's it, y'all. Hope you learned something. I look forward to seeing all of you all's presentations. And again, I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Take care.